Welcome to our Regulation Mastery session. In this session, we will continue reading the CSSF Circular 22-806 from Part 2, Requirements, in the context of ICT Outsourcing Arrangements, Chapter 2. Chapter 2. ICT Outsourcing Arrangements relying on a cloud computing infrastructure. 133. This present chapter provides additional specific requirements to comply with in case of ICT outsourcing relying on a cloud computing infrastructure, hereafter also cloud computing solution. The use of a private cloud without outsourcing is thus excluded from the scope of this chapter. Subchapter 2.1 Definitions and Application. Section 2.1.1 Specific Terminology. 134. For the purposes of this chapter, and in addition to definitions provided in point 1, the following definitions shall apply. 1. Client interface. The software layer made available by the cloud computing service provider to the in-scope entity, allowing the latter to manage its cloud computing resources. 2. Cloud computing resource. Any computing capabilities, e.g. server, storage, network, etc., provided by a cloud computing service provider. 3. Cloud computing service provider. Any firm proposing cloud services within the meaning of the definition of this Chapter 2. 4. In-scope entity. An in-scope entity as defined in point 2, is consuming cloud computing resources for the purpose of carrying out its activities. 5. Multi-tenant. A physical or logical infrastructure serving several, in-scope, entities through shared cloud computing resources, and by means of a standardized model. 6. Resource operation. Managing cloud computing resources made available through the client interface. By extension, resource operator shall mean the natural or legal person that uses the client interface to manage the cloud computing resources. Section 2.1.2 Definition of Cloud Computing. 135. Cloud computing is a model composed of the following 5 essential characteristics. A. On-demand self-service. An in-scope entity can unilaterally provide computing capabilities, such as server time and network storage, as needed automatically without requiring human interaction with the cloud computing service provider. B. Broad network access. Capabilities are available over the network and accessed through standard mechanisms that promote use by heterogeneous thin, e.g. browsers, or thick client, e.g. specific applications, platforms, e.g. mobile phones, tablets, laptops and workstations. C. Resource pooling. The cloud computing service provider's computing resources are pooled to serve multiple, in-scope, entities using a multi-tenant model, with different physical and virtual resources dynamically assigned and reassigned according to in-scope entity demand. There is a sense of location independence, in that the in-scope entity generally has no control or knowledge over the exact location of the provided resources, but may be able to specify the location at a higher level of abstraction, e.g. country, region or data center. Examples of resources include storage, processing, memory and network bandwidth. D. Rapid elasticity. Capabilities can be elastically provisioned and released, in some cases automatically, to scale rapidly outward and inward commensurate with demand. To the in-scope entity, the capabilities available for provisioning often appear to be unlimited, and can be appropriated in any quantity at any time. E. Measured service. Cloud systems automatically control and optimize resource use by leveraging a metering capability at some level of abstraction appropriate to the type of service, e.g. storage, processing, bandwidth and active user accounts. Resource usage can be monitored, controlled and reported, providing transparency for both the provider and the in-scope entity of the utilized service. Section 2.1.3 Conditions of Application of Chapter 2. 136. An outsourcing is considered as outsourcing to a cloud computing infrastructure, within the meaning of this circular, and governed by the requirements of this Chapter 2, if the 5 essential characteristics defined in point 135 and both of the following specific requirements are fulfilled. A. Under no circumstances may staff employed by the cloud computing service provider access data and systems that an in-scope entity owns on a cloud computing infrastructure, without prior and explicit agreement of the in-scope entity, and without monitoring mechanism available to the in-scope entity to control the accesses. These accesses must remain exceptional. Nevertheless, access may be necessary under a legal requirement, or in an extreme emergency following a critical incident affecting part of or all the in-scope entities of the cloud computing service provider. All accesses of the cloud computing service provider must be restricted and subject to preventive and detective measures in line with sound security practices, and audited at least annually. B. The cloud service provision does not entail any manual interaction by the cloud computing service provider as regards the day-to-day management of the cloud computing resources used by the in-scope entity, e.g. provisioning, configuration, or release of cloud computing resources. Thus, the resource operator alone, i.e. either the in-scope entity, or a third party other than the cloud computing service provider, shall manage its ICT environment hosted on the cloud computing infrastructure. However, the cloud computing service provider may intervene manually. For global management of ICT systems supporting the cloud computing infrastructure, e.g. maintenance of physical equipment, deployment of new solutions non-specific to the in-scope entity, or 2. Within the context of a specific request by the in-scope entity, e.g. provisioning of a cloud computing resource that is missing in the catalog proposed by the cloud computing service provider, or performing insufficiently.